welcome to your autoscaling Magento session. In the next, 15 minutes or so, I'll give you some intuition what autoscaling is, when to use it, and give you a few practical tips on implementing it in the context of Magento. So, my name is Piotr, I'm edrone CTO. Where I lead a group of very talented engineers. Prior to that, I worked at Skill Pages, a platform used worldwide by 25 million users. In both of these places, scaling was our key challenge. As you can see, I'm a big fan of Amazon Web Services. I tend to work a lot with those. Just a quick show of hands. How many people here use Amazon Web Services or know what it is? Okay, we've got a few. Right, so scaling is a somewhat vague term, so let's try to define it a little bit better here. By scaling in this presentation, I mean adding processing power to your system in order to meet some increasing demand in the load. In case of Magento, this would be typically increase in the number of requests per second. And there are two basic approaches to that. One is vertical scaling here, so go up, and the other is horizontal scaling, which in case of Amazon is autoscaling. Well, autoscaling is Amazon's term, Amazon's concept. Essentially, it is automating horizontal scaling. Now, both of these are actually good strategies. You will typically hear about horizontal scaling being used by, big players like Facebook or Google, but there are many successful companies that use vertical scaling as well. First of all, these days, vertical scaling can get you quite far. So vertical scaling is about buying a bigger box. You usually end up in a sort of high-end spec there, whereas horizontal scaling is more like commodity machines, sometimes not that different from what you've got under your desk at work. So, with Amazon, they recently announced X1 instances which have 2 terabytes of RAM. So this can actually, get you quite far there. Sure, it's $4 an hour, but you can get the idea. So, vertical scaling can get you quite far these days because of just the Moore's law and the power of the machine. Secondly, there's very little or even no change to the application, right? So this is actually a big one. If you're running some legacy, extension, some legacy code, sometimes you don't have the source code for stuff to modify, running some binaries, you may actually not have another option. There are fewer moving parts as well. As you'll see with horizontal scaling, IP addresses tend to change. There are many more components to manage. And finally, there is also the network aspect. So here, you tend to sort of stay usually within the confinement of a single box, whereas here you've got network, and this can be a dramatic change on your application when all of a sudden your components are distributed, and if the application was not designed to do that, it may actually act really, really badly. Right, so sometimes this is just the right way to go, but sometimes it's not. And you may want to consider something else. So what are the sort of main reasons why you may consider horizontal scaling and then in consequence auto-scaling? First of all, cost. So with your servers, you will typically have CPU, memory, network, and disk, right? And it's rather unlikely that all of those are bottlenecks on your system at the same time. Most likely it's just one or two of those, but with this kind of approach where you just have a single server, it's sort of all or nothing, you have to pay for all of that. And because you're getting the big hardware, it's not a secret in the industry that the margins are much higher, right? So the vendors actually charge more. Secondly, when it comes to cost, you have to provision for your peak load. Many of you are in the e-commerce business, so you may actually have seen that firsthand, where 80% of all your orders are made in the span of a couple of weeks. And then what do you do with all this unused hardware, right? So this is cost. This is a big one from sort of availability and operational point of view. One server means single point of failure, right? So If you're considering something like 24/7 availability, this is really no-go here. The other part is deployments and ease of that, and it's also related to operations. Canary analysis, this is something that is sort of popular in all those big sites when you tend to deploy just a small fraction of your fleet. The term canary actually comes from the bird. It used to be used in mines to detect methane. There, you would just put the bird, and if it doesn't come back, then it's so good. So it's essentially the same idea here. So any type of rolling deployments, gradual deployments, A/B type of testing, it's much easier to do when you have more than one server, or even possible. And finally, the stress. Do not underestimate that, because this can sort of cripple your desire to experiment. If you're afraid of touching production just because there's just this one thing, you're just not going to be innovative and trying things out there. Not to mention your burnout and your boss shouting at you that the site is down again. Right, so essentially the idea is that it's easier to grow, to deal with many sort of regular type of things than just this one big one. By the way, I asked our graphic designer to prepare a programming related slide. That's what she prepared. Right, so by far the single most important thing that you need to do in order to prepare for auto-scaling is to move the state out of your machine, right? So anything that is persistent has to go. Why? Because your machines will be disappearing. They will be killed like crazy, okay? So obviously, almost the definition of a state is a database. In case of Amazon, you may want to push it to RDS, which is just a managed version. They support most of the engines, including MySQL, Postgres, whatever you're doing. Now, this is not really scaling, right? We're just kicking the can down the road. So scaling database is generally rather complex topic. So we will not cover it here. But the idea is here just to move it out of your side, make it somebody else's problem. Here, most likely, you will need vertical scaling, right? If you don't have ability to modify the application to be horizontally scalable as far as data store is concerned, then you don't have that many options. You've got things like sessions, or in the same area, you've got caches, you've got any type of media files. So with e-commerce shops, it's usually the pictures, sometimes tons of those, and any type of sort of sysops data, logs, etc. Right, so with database out of the way, let's briefly talk about other options, what you do with the rest of those. So here are some ideas that are actually tried out. There are many ways to skin the cat. You can do it however you like, but here's an example. So this is about media files, about pictures. One way to do that is, again, make it somebody else's problem. So use a spree here. Are you guys familiar with a spree service? Okay. Even if you're not using Amazon like for instances, their VMs, etc. I would recommend taking a look at that. It's a very easy to use service, which has some really great sort of benefits. It makes life easier. First of all, it's very durable. What I mean by that is that Amazon promises they will lose at most one object per billion in any given year for that. I have actually stored, I think, more than 2 billion objects at some point in our system, and they have never lost any. At least I haven't noticed. Right, so that's one, and it scales very, very well. The only caveat is if you're planning to do a lot of traffic to that, you need to name your things properly, but you can find it in documentation. What's the downside? The latency. So it's great for, it's a key value store, right, where value can be up to 5 terabytes, I believe, so you can store any file that you want there. But the latency is not really that great, especially if you're running it using it to store images, right? You want instantly loaded images, which is why usually you want to put some sort of content distribution network in front of that. again, Amazon's native solution is CloudFront, but there are many others on the market. The sort of nice thing about all of that, there are tools that actually pretend that this is just a file system. Now, it's not a regular network file system. Do not treat it like this, please, but sort of from the perspective of, say, Magento, it doesn't have to know that there's actually something like this. The tools will replicate that automatically, right, to that S3 bucket. You don't have to care, you don't need to change anything. The only thing that you want to change is just the URL to your images, right? But this is just a configuration change, and that works pretty well, right? With session, so again, we need to take it out from the instance. So sort of the natural choice here is some sort of distributed store like Memcache or Redis. Magento supports both, and both are actually also supported by Amazon as a managed service. With Redis, you can set up a read replica, so that works well if you're planning on high availability. So not much to do here. Again, just the configuration change for this. And finally, just like we moved all the application data out of the instances, you want to do the same with all the sort of operational stuff. So all your logs, Magento logs, web server, Apache, or Nginx, whatever you've got there, your syslog, kernel, everything, it should go. The idea is that you don't really SSH into those instances anymore, right? That's sort of the holy grail. Everything is somewhere centralized. This is one example of how to do that. You just install agents. All of this is sort of provided for you. They push it to a service called CloudWatch Logs, and based on that, you can examine that, monitor, graph charts. But again, there are many solutions to this. There's Splunk, Loggly, there's Logstash with Elasticsearch and Kibana, so really a lot of options. But I guess you sort of get the general sort of theme here, that you treat those as sort of boxes where you just run something for a period of time, and then they just die off. You don't really store anything persistent here. So once you did all of this, you're sort of in this phase. So your server is no longer your pet. That you do not hack your servers, right? Because they don't hack you back. That's vowels from Amazon. You don't call them cute names from Greek names or whatever. No, rather you don't even give them names, right? These are just some identifiers like cattle. No vegetarians here, but you get the idea, right? Tomorrow you may not see this guy again. Right. So now, sort of, you did all of this. You did your homework on this. It's the first part, so now let's talk about the solution itself, the auto-scaling engine. So it can basically do three things for you. Let's go briefly through that. So first of all, there's instance replacement. What it means is that the engine will monitor your servers, and if it decides that they are sick, there's something wrong with them, they will just shoot them in the head and spawn a new one, right? You maintain the desired level, how many you want, and this is it. This is useful if something happens at 3 a.m. It will just do automatic replacement for that, and you can even use that if you have a single server. Even in the case of vertical scaling, you can actually set an auto-scaling group of one just for that particular reasons. Now the question obviously is, how does it know that the server is sick? This is always the tricky part. If you did any type of alerting and monitoring, you're aware how hard this is. So there are some built-in health checks, so it can detect that there's no power to the server automatically and stuff like that. That happens very rarely, by the way. But for some sort of more advanced stuff, you can provide your own scripts that will do that. And with sort of health checks, there is always this balance that you need to strike between the health check being overreactive, meaning panicking too fast and saying that the server is sick, even though it's not. So that's called false positive. And on the other hand, false negative. So just not detecting the failure when it should, and your customer is just seeing 500 page. So it's always a balance. okay? And you need to choose which one you want to. It's a trade-off, right? Which you need to choose. You can't have both. Scheduled scaling. This is sort of like a cron that you just basically set up and say, okay, I want my servers turned on at this hour, date, and so on. This sounds really boring, but it's quite useful in certain scenarios. Just coming back to that sort of e-commerce type of scenarios that happen quite a lot when it's before Christmas, and you know that every year, a few weeks before Christmas, the madness starts, so you can just configure it then. It's useful for saving cost. So if you have some development environments that you just want to power off automatically when people go home, we use it for that quite a lot. So this is an example of sort of predictive scaling. So you are predicting. It's very crude and it's very simplistic, but it's also easy to understand. Thanks for that. So it's got some power. And then the holy grail, so dynamic scaling. When you hear cloud computing, it's usually that they try to sort of convince you why it's so great that you don't need to maintain more power than you actually need, and as your demand grows, the servers are added and so on. So this is all based on this. The idea is simple. There is some sort of metric that it tracks, and it can be any metric. It can be something built in like CPU utilization, network traffic, or you can provide your own like load averages, some sort of weird number of requests, non-standard stuff, and etc. And it watches the metric, and if that metric exceeds certain threshold, it will just spawn new instances. Depending how you configured it, it can react to not just to the fact that it crossed the threshold or not crossed, but also to the magnitude. So it can figure out the difference between 80% CPU utilization and 40 if you want. So this is the cool stuff. There are some caveats to that as well. Things, if you're planning on implementing this, that you may want to consider. First of all, if your peaks, so if your spikes in sort of activity are very short, okay, this may not work that well. The reason being, so the engine A has to figure out that it needs to actually add instances. That's typically quite fast, say around 10 seconds or so. So then it takes your image and it launches it, and then it needs to run all the launch script that you have configured, if you've got any. But quite often you will have some sort of at least deploy the latest version of the code, whatever. And depending on how long it takes, you may actually miss your spike, right? That defeats the whole purpose. So. Just from my personal experience, this is usually a few minutes, okay? If your spikes are shorter than that, then you may want to reconsider. The other funny scenario that may happen is when you've got an outage. So what happens, or say you push some change to Magento, right? And some links are broken now, so you actually have less traffic to your site, and this guy may not understand that, right? It may not understand that this is due to some problem, as opposed to, and it will just downsize your fleet. So if you've ever watched the graphs, what happens after the outage, your customers are coming back, right? And there's a spike. So in this scenario, they will just see, the downsized fleet because of this. This is part of the reason.
One question. How do you serve when someone DDoS your application? Do you scale application up and make more instances, or just keeping in mind that it can be DOS and someone can someone won't make you run out of budget?
Give me that again. The first part of the question.
The first part. What do you do when there is high peak or traffic because of DDoS? Distributed denial of service.
Right. So, yeah, distributed denial of service is sort of a tricky one to deal with anything. That actually. The one situation in the previous company that I actually experienced it firsthand, we ran it through the system that cleanses the traffic. So there are companies that that do that for you, and they have sort of emergency. We're going off the tangent here a little bit, but you can just ask them and reroute all your traffic to do that. Amazon is doing some of that as well for you. So with your service, the servers here, actually, if you know the traffic reaches those, then there's not much you can do. But most likely you're running a load balancer in front of those, and this is capable of absorbing quite a lot of traffic, actually, for that. Similarly, like CloudFront, the CDN is actually very tough, I think, to bring down. I've never heard about anything succeeding in those. So they have a lot of access sort of network bandwidth, but once you're at the point of your instance, you're limited, you know, to what you've got, right?
I meant just very clever attacks to endpoints that make, for example, high load on your server.
If it's application level attack, really not that much that you can do, I think.
Okay, so just there is manual action required, yes.
Well, you know, there are some intrusion sort of prevention systems out there that may sort of help you out there, but you know, even the biggest players fall victim to those. So
yeah, but if you are running e-commerce and you are attacked by DOS, you can run out of budget and you are out of internet for
yes.
few hours or days or days if it's holiday.
Let's take that offline, okay? Right, so we are here with dynamic scaling. Lunch is almost there, so right, so the last part, as you can imagine, Amazon has quite a lot of servers actually. So what they do is at any point in time they sort of have unused capacity. And they do a pretty smart thing. They are selling it again with discounted prices, so you can get the same machine that you normally pay for 20, even 20% of you know, of price. These are called spot instances, and they can be automatically configured to be used with auto scaling. The catch here is that it's a sort of supply and demand business, just like stock market. So depending on how many people want to use those, the prices go up and down, and you just say how much you're willing to pay. Obviously, you want to set the price point lower than the normal one. The main catch is that they, at any point in time, they can just knock to your door and say, hey, we want our server back, right? And they kindly give you 2 minutes notice on that. So your system has to detect that. It has to pack all the stuff it has, send it somewhere else, and give the machine back. Essentially, it has to be written in a sort of fault-tolerant way, and this is a premium, really, for designing and architecting your system like this. Hadoop is a good example that actually fits this model very nicely for data processing. So apart from master nodes, the slave actually can work like this, and the system recovers, and many people use it like this. So that's it, folks. Sorry for the delay. If you've got any questions, I'll be happy to. Maybe if there's lunch, so maybe we could talk about. Yeah, one question.
Should I ask? Or,
yes.
So I have a question. When you're scaling a database vertically,
yeah.
Is it a way to do this without relaunching the instance in Amazon? Since I'm not that familiar with Amazon, so I would like to, order a little bit more of IOPS or resources for database. Is there a way to do this without rebooting?
Without rebooting, I'm afraid not, but it's a sort of very RDS specific question, so we can talk about it later in details, but you can go multi-AZ with RDS, so get a second instance there, it will scale up the other instance, then it will move your traffic, it's shifted, you will have a downtime of about, say, 1 minute when your application realizes that it's a new IP address, provided that it doesn't caches your DNS. And then it will do the other server. So
let's go.
yeah. Thank you.